The mother allowed her daughter to ride her bike around the courtyard, but when she checked on her a few minutes later, she discovered that the girl had vanished without a trace. Police were immediately called, but they were unable to find either the child or her bicycle. The mystery continued for 2 years until an unexpected breakthrough in the investigation revealed the shocking truth about the disappearance. Kelly Ann Poulton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York, and was the only child in her family. Her parents surrounded her with limitless love and care. However, when she was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce. Kelly stayed with her mother, while her father maintained a warm relationship with his ex-wife and continued to see his daughter. Kelly's mother, Judy, moved to a quiet residential complex in the suburbs of Rochester. Despite financial support from her ex-husband, they lived modestly. When the girl turned 4, her mother started working part-time, dreaming of saving enough money for a trip to Disneyland together. Judy's job involved delivering magazines to subscribers in her area. On the evening of May 23, 1994, she was preparing for another delivery, sitting at home and inserting advertising brochures into magazines before their distribution. Around 6:45 p.m., Kelly expressed a desire to go outside, taking advantage of the beautiful weather to ride her bright tricycle. Peering outside and seeing that the playground was filled with children, Judy decided to let her daughter play outside for a while, warning her to stay within sight and not to leave the area near their home. Kelly happily went outside on her tricycle, while her mother finished preparing the magazines and planned to head to McDonald's. After finishing the magazine preparation, Judy went to her car to load the magazines, deciding to call Kelly home in the process. However, upon stepping outside, she found no trace of her daughter. Judy searched the surroundings and started calling Kelly by name, but received no answer. Walking around the house and not finding her daughter, she expanded her search to the entire residential complex, but Kelly was nowhere to be found. The absence of the characteristic sound of the tricycle's wheels on the asphalt, which always accompanied the girl's riding, was particularly alarming. Everything around was unusually quiet, emphasizing the absence of any signs of her daughter. With growing despair, Judy became increasingly panicked. Her loud cries for help immediately attracted the attention of neighbors, who rushed to find out what had happened. The woman asked if anyone had seen her daughter, but only a few noted that they had seen Kelly playing in the yard with other children, unaware of her subsequent whereabouts. Hearing about the disappearance, neighbors did not hesitate to join the search, but neither Kelly nor her bicycle was found. The residential complex's territory was mostly covered with vegetation, and it was surrounded by a fence protecting it from the neighboring road. Convinced that her daughter couldn't have left on her own, Judy knew 2 things. First, Kelly was aware of the boundaries within which she was allowed to ride and always followed this rule. Second, given the small size of her bike, the girl couldn't have gone far and remained unnoticed. Fearing the worst, Judy immediately contacted the police. Arriving on the scene in no time, the officers began their actions, joined by fire crews and canine units with dogs, who started a thorough inspection of the area and adjacent lots. While law enforcement spread out to search the residential buildings for Kelly, the police theorized that the girl was unlikely to have left the residential complex on her own. Considering a possible abduction, the main suspicions would likely fall on local residents, as it would be difficult for an outsider to enter the complex unnoticed, approach the house, snatch the girl, take her to a car, and carry out all these actions without being detected. In the residential complex, which includes 300 apartments, residents readily allowed the police to enter, genuinely eager to aid in the search for the missing girl. In instances where no one was present in the apartments, the complex manager provided the police with spare keys for access. Despite these efforts, no results were forthcoming. Neither the girl nor her bike were found. The search continued all night, and around 4 in the morning, the case was reclassified as an abduction, and a specialized unit, along with detectives, took over the investigation. They asked Judy about possible enemies in their lives, mentioned Kelly's father, but the woman excluded his involvement, pointing to the father's regular communication with his daughter and lack of motive. Then the detectives inquired about people in the complex whose behavior might have seemed unusual or suspicious to her. In response, Judy mentioned a new resident, a 22-year-old man named Mark, who had recently moved in with his wife and 18-month-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior always seemed unconventional and troubling to her. During several random encounters in the yard, they conversed, and in one of these conversations, Mark commented on the beauty of her daughter. While Judy often heard similar compliments from others, the way Mark expressed himself seemed unusual to her. He then said something even more peculiar, claiming that he watched all the girls in the complex and Kayli stood out as the most beautiful. Judy found such remarks to be very alarming, and she tried to limit any further interaction with him. Despite this, their paths sometimes crossed, and at one of these meetings, Mark asked Judy a question she found highly inappropriate. He inquired whether Kayli would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy affirmed and immediately walked away from Mark, considering such a question to be very suspicious. Before these events, Kayli often played with Mark's son on the playground, but afterwards, Judy did not allow her daughter to approach him, even when she was nearby. During the conversation with the detectives, Judy recalled another moment. Shortly after she began searching for her daughter outside, she noticed Mark, who had come to the playground with his son. When she asked him about Kayli, he denied seeing her. She also found it odd that his shoes were without laces, but at that moment, she didn't give it much thought, as she was focused on her concern for her daughter. Deciding to question Mark, detectives brought him to the police station. The man denied any involvement in Kayli's disappearance and even agreed to a polygraph test. The polygraph operator found no signs of deception in his answers, which led to the necessity of releasing Mark. Furthermore, Judy unwittingly confirmed his alibi, remembering seeing him with his son at the playground during the period she was searching for her daughter. At the initial stage of the search, Mark's apartment was inspected by the police, where neither Kayli's bike nor the girl herself was found. Consequently, Mark was ruled out as a suspect, and detectives continued their investigation without any significant leads. Their actions included scrutinizing Judy for involvement in her daughter's disappearance. The woman understood this was part of the standard procedure and cooperated with the police, answering questions. However, the lack of other suspects and the prolonged attention to her from law enforcement only intensified her grief. Information about Kayli's disappearance was widely disseminated in the local media, as well as through billboards and flyers throughout the city. This led to an overwhelming number of calls to the police with potential information, exceeding 1,000. Each tip was meticulously checked by investigators, but none led to solving the mystery of the girl's disappearance, and the case reached a deadlock for an extended period. Despite the lack of noticeable progress in the search, Judy did not lose hope of finding her daughter alive. She took leave from work and dedicated herself to the search, actively engaging in printing and distributing flyers and seeking support from various media outlets. Her efforts resonated with the public. Volunteers actively helped her, and a sum of $100,000 was collected, offered as a reward for any information that could help find Kayli. Moreover, her daughter's story was featured at the national level, including participation in the famous Oprah Winfrey Show and mention in a program investigating unsolved crimes. Judy did not stop there. She arranged with local businesses to distribute flyers in their offices, factories, and even on company transport. She also managed to convince 2 airlines to include these flyers in their ticket packets, attracting additional attention and new tips, each of which was carefully checked by the police. However, all these efforts did not lead to a significant breakthrough in the investigation, and it continued for 2 years until an unexpected event occurred in 1996. On August 9th, a call came into the police from a woman reporting a serious argument with her husband. According to the woman, she had reached her limit due to her husband's ambiguous behavior and declared her desire to divorce. In an attempt to keep her, the husband tried to appeal to her feelings, playing the victim of circumstances and complaining about personal hardships. Suddenly, he confessed to the murder of Kayli Poulton, shocking his wife deeply. She immediately took her child and went to her father's house, from where she called 911. During the call, she revealed her husband's name, Mark Christie, the very man who was Judy's neighbor. This story was a surprise for the detectives, yet they immediately faced a legal obstacle. According to state law, any information shared between spouses was protected by confidentiality and could not be used as evidence in court. This meant that even Mark's confession did not provide grounds for his arrest and interrogation. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, the man's residence had been searched at the beginning of the investigation, and he had been seen walking with a child soon after Kelly's disappearance, casting doubt on his ability to commit the crime. Despite the challenges that arose, Detective Crow, upon hearing the revelations from Mark's wife, immediately wanted to have a conversation with Mark himself. It turned out that Mark and his family had left the residential complex where Kelly lived shortly after her disappearance, with serious allegations being the reason for their departure. Parents of two girls complained about Mark, pointing out that he stood naked in his doorway in their presence. Despite the lack of an official investigation into these complaints, since Mark was within his own home, this fact seemed very suspicious to Crow. Mark had moved to a town 50 miles away from Rochester, and Crow set out to find him. However, his visit was not successful. Mark's mother met him at the door, informing him that her son would not speak to the police without a lawyer. They had already contacted a lawyer in anticipation of this meeting. It appeared Mark was aware of his wife's conversation with the police regarding their argument, and Crow realized he was at a dead end. Given the impossibility of using Mark's confession to his wife in court, a lawyer could easily forbid any attempts by the police to contact his client. Thus, Mark could continue living freely without fear of further pursuit. Nonetheless, Crow was not quick to admit defeat. While he was talking to Mark's mother, Mark himself appeared at the doorway. The detective managed to convince him that his intentions were merely to ask a few questions about Kelly's case. Crow suggested going to a nearby cafe for a chat over a cup of coffee. To Crow's surprise, Mark agreed, on the condition that he would be taken to his lawyer after the conversation. They stopped at a cozy Italian cafe nearby. Throughout the meeting, the detective maintained a calm and friendly conversation, trying not to pressure Mark. And this strategy bore fruit. Before their order even arrived, Mark suddenly began to pour out his soul. He confessed that the act he had committed against Kelly had tormented him for the past 2 years. The image of the girl, which flashed in the news and on flyers, haunted him everywhere. Crow remained extremely cautious, fearing to scare Mark off with too much pressure. He was one of the first detectives on Kelly's disappearance case, so their dialogue was not their first. Crow hoped that Mark might feel a sense of satisfaction from having deceived the police and decided to use this, playing on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to fool the entire investigative team, and this tactic truly worked. Mark stated that he didn't want to appear self-satisfied, emphasizing that the method he used to dispose of the bicycle was indeed ingenious. He wondered if the detective would like to know the details of this operation, but immediately cautioned that he was willing to share information only about the bicycle, not touching on other aspects of the case. Crow continued to interact with Mark in a light and friendly tone, trying to extract as much information as possible while making it clear that Mark was not obliged to share anything he didn't want to discuss. Then Mark revealed that Kelly's bicycle was in his living space for 3 whole days after her disappearance. He realized that if a child's life was threatened, the police could conduct a search without a warrant, checking every apartment in the complex. But there was a specific limitation in the law. It allowed searching for a missing child, but not for evidence related to their disappearance. This meant the police had the right to inspect only those places where a child theoretically could be. Taking advantage of this loophole in the law, Mark decided to cut the bicycle into pieces and hide them in various hidden corners of his apartment, which were clearly not intended for hiding a child. For example, Mark wrapped some parts of the bike in clothes and stacked them neatly in closets, while other parts were packed in compact bags, which he then carried to his car. He then began disposing of the parts in stages, discarding them away from his residence. Police officers were on duty at the exit of the compound, searching every vehicle, including Mark's vehicle, which was checked repeatedly. However, since the officers' attention was focused on finding the missing girl, the small bags went unnoticed. As he listened to Mark's story, Crow realized that he had a chance to elicit a full confession from him. He began to convince Mark that the girl's death might not have been his fault, but only a tragic accident. When asked about possible punishment, Mark heard Crow say that he could face up to 25 years in prison. Mark countered that he thought such a punishment was unfair, as he would have to spend half of his life in prison, missing the opportunity to be near his wife and son. He also mentioned that the last 2 years of his life had been a personal hell, which he felt should be taken into account when sentencing him. Despite the strangeness of such statements, Crow continued to follow his strategy of suggesting that Mark ease his soul by telling what really happened. The man replied that he was ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective realized that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to a crime, even if he really committed it and if there was no evidence against him. So he decided to be honest with Mark about it and added that in that case the girl's parents would never know what had happened to their daughter or whether she had suffered before she died. And then Mark replied, "She didn't suffer." The detective sensed that the man was ready to admit everything. So he said it was time to do the right thing for his own sake, his family's sake, and God's sake. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally confessed what he had done. He repeated that the girl had not suffered and said he had strangled her. He then added that he did not do anything to her, meaning abuse. According to Mark, that night, Kayli drove up to his apartment and asked to play with his 1.5-year-old son. The man let her in and took the girl's bike into the kitchen. He realized that Kayli's mother would not allow the girl into his home, so he decided not to attract attention. Kayli went up to the second floor of the apartment to the children's room and began playing with the child. About 10 minutes later, Mark heard Judy go out into the yard and start calling his daughter's name. The man panicked, realizing that his mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his home without her permission. So Mark went up to his child's room and strangled Kayli with his bare hands. Of course, Detective Crow immediately had doubts about the plausibility of some aspects of the story. Much more likely would be the version that Mark himself lured the girl to his apartment under the pretext of playing with his son, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work. There, he could have committed any lewd acts against her, and when he heard Judy calling for her, he was afraid that Kayli would tell her. The detective also remembered that Judy had seen him on the street wearing sneakers without laces and allowed that the man had actually used them when he choked the girl, and that would mean that the crime was not so spontaneous, since he would have had time to think things over while he took the laces out of the sneakers. Apparently, Mark tried to minimize the gravity of his crime by omitting some details. Crow understood that if he expressed his doubts, Mark might change his mind and refuse to talk about what he did with the body. However, the detective needed this information, so he continued to nod and listen to Mark's story. Mark stated that after committing the murder, he carried Kayli's body to the kitchen and left it on the floor. Then he took his son and went outside to create an alibi for himself. The man continued to hear Judy calling her daughter in the yard, so he specifically wanted to be seen by her to remove any suspicion from himself. After the woman saw him at the playground and left to search for her daughter around the complex, Mark returned home and placed Kayli's body in a laundry basket, covering it with clothes. A few minutes later, he took the basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car. At that time, there were many people in the yard helping Judy look for her daughter, and such chaos reigned that no one even paid attention to Mark. He freely got into his car, took his son, and drove to the facility where he worked as a security guard. Arriving at the back of the large building, Mark left the basket with Kayli's body next to the door, and after driving around the building, entered through the main entrance. On his day off, Mark fabricated an excuse for his colleagues, claiming he needed to return to work for items he had forgotten there, which raised no suspicion. Because of this, he effortlessly passed through the workspace and unlocked the back door from the inside. Then the man took the basket containing the victim and approached a huge refrigerant tank with a capacity of over 100,000 liters. Opening the top lid, he threw Kayli inside after tying a heavy metal object he found nearby to her. Following this, Mark disposed of the victim's clothes, specifying that he did not remove her earrings. After eliminating the body, he returned home and joined the search for Kayli with other residents of the complex, managing to remove the body from the premises before the police arrived, remaining unnoticed. At the end of his confession, he said that killing Kayli was a big mistake and he should not have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Detective Crow paid the bill for their meal, and Mark left a $2 tip. Then Mark went to the police station with the detective without objection, where he was arrested on a murder charge. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his confessional statements, he tried to have them annulled and retracted, but to no avail. Mark had provided all the information voluntarily, and Detective Crow's actions were entirely within the law. Without delay, the police went to Mark's workplace, where the specified tank was opened. 2 years later, the girl's remains were still inside, and although the degree of decomposition of the remains did not allow for an exact determination of the cause of death or other circumstances, experts confirmed her identity. Judy was finally able to hold a funeral for her daughter. Mark pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, as Crow had anticipated. The lawyer managed to negotiate a deal in which the kidnapping charge was dropped, leaving only the murder sentence in effect. However, Mark's story did not end there. In 2010, the police decided to revisit a 1988 case when 74-year-old Viola Menville was brutally murdered in a Rochester suburb after going out for a walk. Among several suspects was Mark, who at that time was only 16 years old. After an interrogation with a polygraph, the operator detected no signs of deception. Frank Sterling was eventually arrested for the murder of Viola Menville. Initially, he denied any involvement, but under the pressure of continuous interrogation throughout the night, he eventually confessed. After Frank was imprisoned, he attempted to contest his conviction, arguing that his confession was coerced under police pressure. And by the end of the interrogation, he barely understood the situation. However, all of Frank's attempts to prove his innocence failed until 2010, when the case was reopened and DNA found at the crime scene was sent for analysis. The results showed that the sample did not belong to Frank, but a match was found in the FBI database with Mark Christie. In 2011, Mark, then 39 years old, was charged with the murder of Viola and received an additional 28 years in prison. Mark never explained his motives, nor expressed any remorse. Frank was released after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment, sued the state, and in 2014 was awarded nearly $10 million. However, 3 years later, Frank died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence, and with changes in New York state law, he may be eligible for early release in the coming years, though there are no guarantees of his release. It's important to note that if the investigation into Viola Menville's case had not focused solely on Frank as the suspect, and had not coerced him into confessing to a crime he did not commit, Mark might have been arrested earlier, and Kelly might not have become his victim. But events unfolded differently.